Tragic death of a 12-year-old boy caught in his system. The courtroom froze. Millions watched. But what did Jasmine Crockett say that left America shaking and Arpaio speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It started with a headline that no one expected, but everyone instantly understood. Congress sets the stage. Crockett versus Arpaio. The House Judiciary Committee, known for its tense and often partisan hearings, had just announced a high-stakes session on the legacy of border security and police reform. But beneath the bureaucratic title, the real story pulsed with drama. Jasmine Crockett, young, black, fierce, and unrelenting, had been appointed as the lead interrogator. Her target? Joe Arpaio, the infamous former sheriff of Maricopa County, whose name was synonymous with racial profiling, tent city prisons, and federal contempt charges. No warning, no vote, just a late-night email from the committee chair's office. "You're up tomorrow." And yes, it's him. Jasmine stared at her screen, jaw tightening, knowing exactly what was at play. They weren't just calling on her legal expertise. They were throwing her into a political lion's den, hoping her fire might burn too bright, too fast. But what they didn't count on was that Crockett had never backed down from a fight, especially not one where the rules were rigged. Not when the entire country was watching. By 6 a.m., the story had already broken across major networks. CNN ran it under a red banner. "Face off at the judiciary, Crockett to question Arpaio in nationally televised hearing." Fox called it a clash of values, framing Arpaio as a misunderstood patriot and Jasmine as a radical firebrand. But the public saw it differently. Twitter erupted with anticipation. Hashtags like Justice and Sheriff and Crockett and Arpaio trended within hours. Journalists dubbed it a generational collision, while pundits sharpened their knives, preparing for spectacle. But Jasmine wasn't here for a show. She was walking into a room where every camera, every mic, every stare was either a weapon or a trap. She knew some of her own colleagues wanted her to fail, to fumble, to fold, to crack under the pressure of confronting a man who had been untouchable for decades. But she also knew something else. Every scar in this system had a name, and Arpaio's name was carved into too many of them. But in Washington, anticipation is never passive. It's volatile, calculated, and laced with power plays behind closed doors. As Jasmine Crockett braced for the national spotlight, she knew this wasn't just about policy or party lines. This was a confrontation years in the making, between two Americas that refused to speak the same language. And on the other end of this collision stood a man whose very name had become synonymous with a particular brand of fear: Joe Arpaio. To his supporters, he was Sheriff Joe, the lawman who never blinked, who ran his county like a frontier town and wore contempt for political correctness like a badge of honor. But to the millions who lived in the crosshairs of his badge, he was not a symbol of order. He was the embodiment of abuse, given a uniform and unchecked power. His most infamous creation wasn't a policy, it was a place. Tent City, an outdoor jail in the blistering Arizona desert, where inmates, mostly undocumented immigrants, black men and Latinos, were forced to live in military surplus tents under triple-digit heat. Some called it inhumane. Others called it a return to Jim Crow with camouflage netting. Arpaio, he called it deterrence. Inmates were denied air conditioning in 110 degrees Fahrenheit heat. Some were shackled for days in direct sunlight. When reporters asked how prisoners could survive such treatment, he shrugged and said, "It's not supposed to be fun. This is punishment." And punishment it was, indiscriminate, unapologetic, and racially skewed. Over 400 people were arrested under his orders with no legal cause, simply because they looked illegal. Entire communities were raided, families torn apart, and children left waiting at bus stops for parents who never came home. When a federal judge ruled that Arpaio's tactics amounted to racial profiling in direct violation of the Constitution, he didn't just disagree, he ignored the order outright. For months, he continued the raids, the detentions, the same heavy-handed tactics he was legally barred from using. Eventually, the Justice Department stepped in. In 2017, Arpaio was found guilty of criminal contempt of court, a rare charge for a law enforcement officer. The case was clear. This wasn't a mistake. It was defiance. But then came the twist, the moment that cemented Arpaio's legend among right-wing circles and infuriated civil rights advocates across the country. Before he could be sentenced, President Donald Trump issued a full pardon, his first as president. In front of cameras, Trump called Arpaio a patriot and a hero, ignoring the judge's ruling, the Constitution, and the families who had suffered. With the stroke of a pen, Arpaio was no longer a convict. He was, once again, a man untouchable by justice. Jasmine Crockett sat in silence, alone in her office as she read line after line of his record. She'd seen injustice before. She'd fought it in courtrooms, in state houses, in alleyways where the law forgot people. But there was something different about Arpaio. His impunity wasn't accidental. It was protected, sanctioned, even celebrated. As she flipped through a digital archive of sealed documents and internal memos obtained during her legal work years prior, one file stopped her cold. It wasn't marked urgent or top secret, just an innocuous title, MCSO Internal. 2011 briefing notes. She opened it with a click, expecting little. But what she found inside turned her still. An internal memo, time-stamped and signed, describing how patrols were to prioritize detention of non-English-speaking males within targeted neighborhoods and instructing deputies to maintain visibility in Spanish-speaking districts for maximum deterrence. One paragraph even advised that community pushback should be framed as threats to law enforcement safety, a preemptive narrative to discredit protesters before they even spoke. The language was coded, careful, but unmistakable in its intent. It wasn't just racial profiling, it was policy. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hands moved with mechanical calm as she encrypted the file, printed 3 copies, and tucked them into a thin manila folder with her initials marked on the corner. This wasn't just evidence, it was ammunition, a weapon of truth sharp enough to cut through the smokescreens and slogans. As the printer clattered to a stop, the final page slid into the tray like the last domino in a long, ugly line. She picked it up, stared at it for a moment, and said softly, more to herself than anyone else, "You've silenced a lot of people, Joe, but not this time, not me." And just like that, the countdown to the hearing truly began, not as a formality, but as a reckoning. The folder was warm in her hands, the paper still faintly smelling of toner, fresh evidence pulled from the ashes of forgotten files. But now it was no longer Jasmine's secret. It was her sword. And as the hearing doors opened, the war for truth began, not with sirens or shouting, but with the slow, deliberate entrance of a man who once believed the law was his to bend. Joe Arpaio stepped into the hearing room like a man returning to his empire. His suit was a sharp desert beige, tailored and pressed, meant to echo the colors of the Arizona sands he once ruled. His chin was held high, posture stiff with pride, as though the courtroom were a parade, and he the grand marshal. Behind him walked his defense attorney, older but equally defiant, and a younger aide with a phone in one hand and talking points in the other. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts as the former sheriff took his seat with the swagger of someone who still believed he answered to no one. His eyes scanned the room, stopping briefly on the Democratic side of the aisle, but only briefly, as if to dismiss it as noise. He adjusted his cufflinks, leaned back in the chair, and exhaled like a man preparing for applause. Then the room shifted. Jasmine Crockett entered without spectacle, but the energy changed like a storm front rolling in. Her hair was pulled into a high, defiant knot, her earrings understated, her blazer as black and crisp as her tone would soon be. She wore no flashy makeup, no bright lipstick. She didn't need it. Her presence alone commanded a silence more powerful than any gavel. A few staffers looked up, some nodding in quiet recognition, others bracing for the collision they knew was coming. Jasmine didn't scan the room. She didn't need to. She walked straight to her seat like someone who already knew where every trap had been laid. When she sat down, she didn't even glance at Arpaio. That silence, that stillness, it was strategy. It was power measured in heartbeats. The chairman cleared his throat, leaned into the mic, and said what the nation had been waiting to hear. We begin today's hearing with opening remarks from Representative Jasmine Crockett. Every lens in the room pivoted. Every mic came alive. The red light on the center broadcast camera blinked twice, then stayed solid. Jasmine looked up, and 14 million Americans looked right back. The moment the chairman called her name, the hearing room shifted from ceremony to spectacle. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't adjust her mic. She didn't even glance at the cameras. Instead, she leaned in slowly, precisely, as if each movement was measured to create the silence that always precedes a detonation. Her fingers rested on the folder before her, its edge worn slightly from the tension in her grip. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because the kind of power she held now didn't come from volume. It came from conviction wrapped in control. "Mr. Arpaio," she said, her voice soft enough to draw the room closer, yet sharp enough to still it completely. It was not the voice of a politician seeking applause. It was the voice of a litigator who had buried men twice as powerful in rooms half as formal. "You've stated repeatedly that your tent city facility was not inhumane, that it was legal, that it was necessary." She didn't look up yet. She let those words rest on the table like a dagger turned hilt first, offered, not thrown. But then came the shift. Jasmine raised her eyes, calm but piercing, locking onto Arpaio like she had waited her entire career for this moment. "So tell me, sir," she continued, "if it wasn't inhumane, if it was also justified, why were over 70% of the people held there never convicted of any crime at all?" The room didn't gasp. It froze. Arpaio blinked, once. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Jasmine didn't let the silence save him. She pressed on, her voice still level, almost surgical in its precision. "That's not speculation. That's not coming from a protest rally or a news article or liberal media. That's coming from your own intake records, records logged, time-stamped, signed off by your officers during your tenure." She flipped open her folder and pulled a single page from the stack, holding it up, not to wave, not to perform, but simply to confirm the truth in black and white. 72% of detainees, booked, processed, held in 100-degree desert heat, forced into pink underwear, denied fans shade, and sometimes water, were people who hadn't been found guilty of anything. Now she leaned back, just slightly, but in that inch of space was a tsunami of moral gravity. "You say it wasn't punishment, Mr. Arpaio," she said, voice low and steady. "But when someone hasn't even been tried, hasn't stood before a judge, and you put them in the desert with no air, no bed, and no due process, what exactly would you call that?" The weight of that question didn't just fall on Arpaio. It dropped on every person watching, on the aides shifting uncomfortably behind him, on the congressional members checking their notes but now unable to look away, on the millions watching live across the country who suddenly realized this wasn't going to be just another hearing. This was the reckoning. The silence after Jasmine's question wasn't the kind that invited answers. It was the kind that exposed the absence of them. Joe Arpaio shifted in his chair, not enough for most people to notice, but Jasmine saw it, that subtle tightening of his jaw, the twitch in the corner of his left eye, the way his fingers drummed once against the oak tabletop, then stopped. These weren't signs of strength. These were signs of a man recalculating. When he finally responded, it wasn't with facts, it was with reflex. "Those numbers," he said, voice thick and raspy, "are just statistics. They don't show the whole picture. We had to maintain order. Law enforcement doesn't work on theory, it works on discipline." He paused as if waiting for the air to back him up. It didn't. "People want safety," he added, his tone rising like he was talking past Jasmine, past the committee, straight into the cameras. "And safety requires strength. You can't go soft on crime." It was the same tired refrain he'd used for years, polished like a badge that no longer shone but still carried weight in the right echo chambers. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Not yet. Her silence was deliberate, precise, unnerving. Then with calm hands she reached into her folder once again. Not frantically, not dramatically. Slowly, methodically. And from it, she pulled a single photograph. It wasn't grainy or abstract. It was heartbreakingly clear. She slid it forward across the polished surface of the witness table, and it came to a stop just inches from Arpaio's cuff-linked wrist. The image showed a man, young, Hispanic, shirtless, lying on sun-baked ground beneath a canvas tent that offered no shade. His lips were cracked, his skin blistered, his eyes open, but lifeless. Jasmine's voice, when it finally returned, was soft, devastatingly soft. "This is Anthony Nunez," she said. "He was 28 years old. He was arrested for unpaid traffic tickets. He never got to court, never got to explain. He was placed in Tent City while awaiting his hearing, and he died." She let that sit, then added, "From heat stroke, alone, on a concrete slab, at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. His internal body temperature was 108 when they found him. Every corner of the hearing room seemed to contract at once. Chairs didn't creak. Papers didn't rustle. Even the usual hum of HVAC above them seemed to vanish." Jasmine didn't raise her voice, not because she was being calm, but because this kind of truth didn't need a spotlight. It needed silence. It needed witnesses. Arpaio opened his mouth, but before words could form, Jasmine cut in. Just enough to take control, not enough to shout. "You say this is about safety. You say law and order aren't always pretty. But tell me, Sheriff, what law was Anthony Nunez violating when he died in your custody without ever being convicted of anything?" Arpaio leaned forward now, voice louder, trying to regain control, not of the hearing, but of the narrative. "The law has to be respected," he barked, his tone caught between defiance and desperation. "You can't run a system if people think there are no consequences. We had to be tough. We had to send a message." Jasmine nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting exactly that. She leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the still, focused energy of someone who had just reached the center of the target. "Consequences," she repeated, almost whispering. "Let's talk about those." Her eyes didn't move. "You disobeyed a federal court order. You defied the Constitution. You racially profiled American citizens. You were found guilty of criminal contempt, and then you were pardoned. Not because you showed remorse, not because you cleared your name, but because power protects power. Because somehow consequences are for the people you locked in tents, not the man who gave the order." Then she paused, just long enough. Her next sentence came like a scalpel. "Where is the justice when a man breaks the law and is rewarded for it?" That line didn't echo in the room. It landed. The word justice still lingered in the air, like the scent of smoke after a controlled explosion. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done, not by a long shot. What she had delivered so far was only the prelude. The emotional blow of Anthony Nunez's death had cracked the room open. Now she was ready to set the foundation on fire. Her fingers moved back to the folder, deliberate, unshaking. This time she didn't just pull out a document. She held up a classified internal email, sealed and redacted for years. Its subject line printed in bold: "Target profiles, high-risk units." Her voice was low, calm, almost unnervingly steady. "This," she said, "is an internal communication dated April 3rd, 2012, between Commander Gerald Mendez, your subordinate at MCSO, and a regional officer at ICE. The subject?" She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Pre-identified neighborhoods for rapid extraction operations." She waited a beat before continuing, her tone hardening. "This email includes a list of apartment complexes, trailer parks, and schools. Yes, schools, where the only selection criteria were Spanish-speaking households, low-income housing units, and the absence of U.S. citizenship records." She paused again, longer this time. "Not warrants, not criminal flags, just ethnicity." Then she read it, word for word. "We recommend executing Phase 2 before end of month. Focus on quick pickups. Use pre-cleared units to minimize press exposure. Target lists attached." Gasps, audible gasps. Not just from the public gallery, but from aides, staffers, and even 2 committee members seated across the aisle. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room as Jasmine laid the page flat on the table, sliding it forward like a queen placing a final piece on a chessboard. "Sheriff Arpaio," she said, eyes blazing now, You didn't just violate people's rights, you engineered a system to erase them, quickly, quietly, and efficiently. She tapped the document with one finger. And now, after all these years, this evidence is no longer sealed, no longer hidden, no longer safe. Across from her, Arpaio's face paled, not from embarrassment, but from calculation. For the first time, he didn't have a soundbite ready. No slogan, no smirk, no scripted defense, just silence. And in that silence, the room understood. This was no longer politics. This was exposure. The oxygen in the room hadn't yet returned when Joe Arpaio did what career survivors always do when the tide turns against them. He played the distance game. He straightened up in his chair, smoothed the front of his suit, and leaned forward just enough to project control without looking defensive. But Jasmine had seen this before. This was classic Arpaio. Never apologize, never acknowledge, always disown. He cleared his throat, looked toward the committee members, not Jasmine, and said in that trademark gravel voice that once echoed across Arizona press briefings, "Let me be perfectly clear. I didn't personally authorize those actions. My team operated under standing protocols. What happened in the field didn't cross my desk." His delivery was steady, well-rehearsed. "It sounds like some people beneath me made judgment calls that may have gone too far," he added, shifting the weight of responsibility to ghosts. "But I never saw this email you're referring to. I never signed anything that directed those kinds of targeting methods." He even shrugged slightly, just enough to seem exasperated, as if he were the victim here, blindsided by bureaucratic chaos beneath him. He looked down at his papers, pretending to search for clarity, but really just trying to outlast the moment. A few of his allies on the dais nodded gently, as if his denial had bought him an inch of breathing room. But Jasmine didn't blink. She let his words hang in the air like smoke curling toward a sprinkler. And then calmly, without theatrics, without even adjusting her mic, she dropped the hammer. Her hand reached back to the folder that had, by now, become something far more dangerous than paper. From it, she slid out a second document, older than the email she'd just exposed, but far more lethal. It had been printed on letterhead from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Faint coffee stains dotted the lower margin. Time had yellowed its edges. But the signature was in sharp, permanent blue ink. She held it up with both hands and said slowly, for the benefit of every camera and every future newsreel, "Then you'll need to explain this." The room leaned in, consciously or not. "This is a March 30th, 2012 internal directive," she continued, her tone unshakable. "It outlines the operational framework for what your office called Phase 2 sweep planning, which, as the email I read earlier confirms, included undocumented sweeps focused on Spanish-speaking neighborhoods, regardless of criminal status." She paused for effect. "This isn't hearsay. This isn't a second-hand briefing. This document includes logistical notes, timelines, and—" she raised it higher, turned it toward the room, "an approval line, initialed and signed by one man." She looked directly at Arpaio now. "You." She stepped aside slightly, allowing a congressional aide to collect the document and feed it into the overhead scanner. Seconds later, the chamber lights dimmed slightly, and the projector cast it in full view behind Arpaio. There, glowing across a 70-inch government-issued screen, was the signature, Joseph M. Arpaio, in unmistakable cursive, next to the box marked, "Approved for Interagency Coordination." You could hear chairs tighten, shoes scuff, the collective sound of people realizing they had just watched a lie unravel in real time. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "You didn't just know, Sheriff. You gave the green light. You didn't watch this happen from a distance. You orchestrated it." Her voice sharpened, not louder but colder. "So I'll ask again. When exactly did you forget signing your own name?" The cameras caught it, a flicker in Arpaio's eyes. For a moment, he looked not like the unshakable lawman of old, but like a man cornered by his own past, staring at the ink trail he could no longer outrun. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. The signature still burned behind him on the giant screen. Silent, undeniable, permanent. But Sheriff Joe Arpaio was not a man built for silence. For decades, when cornered, he didn't back down. He shifted blame, raised his voice, and tried to shrink the room around him. That instinct hadn't left. And now, in the face of overwhelming evidence, he reached for the oldest weapon in his arsenal: arrogance. He leaned forward suddenly, as if trying to regain control by sheer force of posture, his voice flaring not with clarity but with insult. "I don't need a morality lecture," he snapped, "from someone who's never walked a beat. You want to talk law and order? Try being the last line between chaos and the innocent. Try facing real criminals in the dark without knowing if you'll make it home. You read memos. I've lived in the line of fire. I've made the hard calls." His hand cut through the air, gesturing toward Jasmine like she was a child out of her depth. "You don't know what it takes to keep people safe. You've never worn the badge. So forgive me if I don't take policing advice from someone who's only seen the fight from behind a desk." It wasn't just an attack. It was a calculated dismissal designed to strip her authority, her experience, even her humanity in front of a national audience. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't recoil. She didn't even shift in her chair. She waited. Let the words hang. Let him dig. Then she slowly exhaled through her nose, like a boxer refusing to rise to a taunt. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It dropped, lowered to a calm so cold it cracked the floor beneath it. "Tell me something, Sheriff," she said, not looking at the cameras, not playing to the crowd. Just him. "In your version of keeping order, does that include arresting 12-year-old boys because they look out of place? Does it include locking up citizens who don't speak English just because they don't understand how to explain themselves? Does it include this?" Her hands moved, not fast but steady, and from a smaller folder she pulled a photograph and a police report. She held the photo for a moment in her hands. It wasn't for the projector, not for the press pool. This wasn't for spectacle. This was for justice. Then she set the image gently in front of her mic. Her voice did not crack, but her eyes did darken. "This is Mateo Jimenez," she said quietly, 12 years old, born in Tucson, Arizona, U.S. citizen. On May 4th, 2014, he was walking home from soccer practice, alone, wearing cleats and carrying a water bottle. One of your patrol teams picked him up. They said he matched the description of someone foreign walking near a construction site. His only crime? She paused. He didn't have his school ID on him, and he didn't speak English. Now the room was silent, not in confusion, but in something heavier: guilt, dread, recognition. Mateo was detained for 42 hours. 42. She emphasized the number. No call to his parents, no access to a lawyer, no interpreter. For the first 12 hours, no food, no water. A 12-year-old boy. When he was finally released, no one apologized. No one called the family. No press release. Just a child dumped back into the world with a trauma no child should carry. Jasmine took a breath, but only to keep from shaking. She picked up the second sheet, the official MCSO intake report, and held it up briefly. It's all here. Time of arrest, officer's name, holding conditions, and your department's signature approving the sweep zone. She lowered the paper, then paused. Not for drama, but because the next sentence was one no person should ever have to say out loud. 3 weeks after his release, Mateo took his own life. She said it with no tears, not because it didn't hurt, but because the hurt had hardened into steel. He hung himself in his bedroom closet. His mother found him, in his soccer uniform. Even Arpaio didn't speak now, and in that terrible stillness, the hearing stopped being a debate. It became a reckoning. The room had gone still, not quiet, still, like the moment before a siren begins to wail. Mateo Jimenez's name still hung in the air, too sacred now for anyone to follow it with politics. Arpaio sat motionless, his shoulders tight, lips thinned. But even he understood. There was no pivot from this. Not when a 12-year-old boy had died with the taste of trauma still fresh on his tongue. And not when the country was watching. But what neither man nor committee knew in that instant was that outside those wooden walls, the world had already changed. Jasmine Crockett's voice didn't just rattle the halls of Congress. It shattered the boundaries of silence across the nation. It began on Twitter. Exactly 17 minutes after Jasmine uttered Mateo's name, the hashtag Arpaio and Crockett shot into the national trends. By minute 23, it had already passed Biden's speech and NFL draft. By the half-hour mark, it was joined by another, Tent City Truth, and this one hit even harder. Because this wasn't just about politics anymore. It wasn't even just about Arpaio. It was about the flood of pain that had been waiting years, decades for a microphone. The tweets came first in trickles, then in a torrent. Anonymous accounts, verified ones, burners, veterans, paralegals, mothers, former detainees. Some had never spoken publicly before. Others had tried for years, drowned out by bureaucracy and spin. But now, with Jasmine's voice as a spark, the floodgates had burst. They took my husband in 2009. He had just dropped our daughter off at school. He was never charged. He came back 11 days later with infected blisters on both feet. I never forgot the smell of his skin when he got home. I was 17. My crime. Standing outside a Home Depot and looking nervous. I spent 4 nights in Tent City with grown men who thought I was a spy. I still sleep with the lights on. My uncle was diabetic. They wouldn't give him insulin. Said it wasn't urgent. He passed out in the tent. Took 3 days before he saw a nurse. That was under Arpaio. I have the paperwork. And then came the video clips. Unfiltered, raw, unedited truth. Grainy footage taken from flip phones and old camcorders. A man with deep burn scars down his arms showing a photo of himself chained to a fence post. A teacher in Phoenix holding up student essays written by children who watched their parents get detained through classroom windows. A pastor who used to hold Sunday services outside Tent City because detainees said they could hear the music through the fence. They couldn't come to church, he said, so we brought church to them. And Jasmine Crockett? She just brought justice to them. By the end of the first hour, Tent City Truth had over 4.8 million mentions. TikTok creators stitched Jasmine's voice over video edits of protest marches, ICE raids, even drone shots of the long-abandoned Tent City facility. Its rusting fences and torn tarps, now symbols of a country's forgotten conscience. Instagram flooded with photos of old booking forms, mugshots, and the red-pink glow of sunburned skin. Facebook groups formed with names like We Were There and Children of the Tents. Reddit threads popped up with maps, timelines, and legal documents once buried in court archives, now in full public view. In Atlanta, a mural artist began sketching a 20-foot portrait of Jasmine Crockett holding up Mateo's photo. In Chicago, a group of immigration lawyers set up a hotline specifically to offer free counsel to anyone previously detained under Arpaio's command. By nightfall, churches rang bells. Local news anchors in Arizona wept through live broadcasts. And yet, in the center of the storm, Jasmine said nothing. She sat in her chair, hands folded, eyes steady, listening not to the noise but to the weight of it. She knew this wasn't hers. She hadn't started it. She had only given it permission to exist, and sometimes that's all justice needs. Her staffer leaned over, whispering, "Twitter's gone nuclear. You're all over MSNBC. CNN is rebroadcasting your cross-exam on a loop. There are vigils forming in Phoenix and Tucson. Do you want to make a statement?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked across the room, past Arpaio, past the blinking red lights of the cameras, and whispered so softly only her aide could hear, "Let them speak first. We've silenced them long enough." Outside the Capitol, the press line was growing. Journalists from every major outlet shoved mics into each other's space. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you believe Arpaio committed a federal crime? Will you introduce legislation to reopen Tent City investigations? Did you have prior knowledge of the ICE coordination documents?" But Jasmine didn't come out. She let the survivors have the microphone instead. A woman in her 60s stepped forward to a CNN live feed. She held a photograph. Her son, age 23, who had been picked up at a Greyhound station in 2010 and never came back. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "They said he wasn't legal, but he was born in Flagstaff. He had a speech delay. He couldn't tell them where he lived. They thought he was lying." She paused, looked at the camera. "We buried him in silence. But today," she said his name without even knowing it. She made him visible again. A 9-year-old girl stood beside her father, who had spent 11 months in Tent City. She read from a note card. "Thank you, Miss Jasmine. My daddy came home. I hope the other kids' daddies do too." That clip alone would rack up 34 million views in 2 days. And as the sun dipped lower over the Capitol dome, something unthinkable began to happen. Prominent conservative voices, some of them once defenders of Arpaio, began to issue carefully worded statements. One former Arizona state senator tweeted, "We were wrong. The truth hurts. Thank you to @Jasmine Forrest for showing what accountability looks like." A sheriff in Texas announced a review of his department's immigration detainment protocols. A coalition of mayors issued a joint letter asking the Department of Justice to reopen inquiries into Arpaio's ICE partnership history, and the House Oversight Committee announced it would hold a special session the following week, focused solely on the long-term consequences of unchecked law enforcement overreach. But perhaps the most haunting moment of the day came just before midnight. A reporter from the Arizona Republic, broadcasting live from outside a shuttered Tent City gate, said, "I've covered Sheriff Arpaio for over 20 years. I've seen lawsuits come and go. I've seen press conferences, protests, rallies. But I've never seen this. Never seen the flood of voices, pain, and memory rise this fast. All of it, every ounce of it, was unlocked by one hearing. One woman and a 12-year-old boy named Mateo." The wind rustled the chain-link fence behind him, where someone had spray-painted just hours earlier. You can't bury the truth forever, it grows back. The sun had long dipped behind the Capitol dome, but inside the hearing room, the heat had only just begun to rise again. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her fingers interlocked, eyes focused. Around her, the oxygen felt heavier, thick with expectation, tension, and the weight of everything that had just unraveled. And yet, even as millions watched in the stunned silence across the country, Jasmine had not played her final card. Not yet. The viral outcry had detonated across social media. The streets outside were filled with chants and candlelight. Old victims were reclaiming their voices. And yet in the hearing room, one man still sat with his spine straight and his mouth clenched, as if decades of harm could still be shielded behind slogans and denials. Joe Arpaio, pardoned, defiant, untouched, until now. Jasmine looked up. "Mr. Chairman," she said softly but clearly, "with permission, I would like to enter one more piece of evidence into the congressional record." There was a murmur, a pause, then a nod. She pressed a button on the console in front of her. The room darkened slightly as the monitors lit up. No visuals this time, just a waveform, just sound. A voice crackled through the speakers, grainy but unmistakably real. It was a recording of a phone call. Male voices, low and cautious. "Look, we need to get this pardon done before the midterms pick up steam. The sheriff's a symbol. We can't afford to let the far left spin him as a criminal. That narrative's poison." A pause. Then another voice, slicker, polished but colder. "We've got a memo drafted, just need confirmation from upstairs. The language is law enforcement legacy. Stick with that. We don't defend the contempt charge. We pivot, make him a martyr, something to rally the base." And then the third voice, deeper, slower, southern-tinged. Sheriff Arpaio stood firm when most people folded. He's rough, sure, but the left needs a reminder. This is a signal. You come after us, we come back harder. The audio crackled. Someone chuckled. The conversation continued. "So we all agree. Trump signs it by Friday. Quiet drop. Weekend headlines. That gives Fox time to spin it before Sunday. Done? He stays our tough guy. We use him to crush the narrative before it grows legs." Jasmine didn't say a word. She let the silence settle. The implication did the speaking. The entire room froze. Congressional aides blinked at each other. One Republican member opened his mouth, then shut it again. The voice in that tape wasn't confirmed, but it didn't need to be. The content alone was a grenade tossed into the illusion of justice. Then, as if trying to rise from the ashes of exposure, Arpaio slammed his palm onto the table. The sudden noise cut through the room like a rifle shot. His face was flushed now, not with pride, but with fury. "This is outrageous," he barked, eyes darting from one committee member to another. "This isn't a hearing. This is a goddamn political ambush. You're using this room to stage a hit job, to smear a man who's served his country longer than she's been out of law school. He jabbed his finger in Jasmine's direction, veins bulging in his temple. You want to talk about justice? This isn't justice. This is a circus, a televised takedown. I won't be part of it. Reporters in the back typed furiously. Camera zoomed in. Some aides flinched. But Jasmine? She didn't move. She waited for the roar to collapse under its own weight. Then with a voice low and calm, so calm it cut deeper than shouting ever could, she replied, "No, Mr. Arpaio, this isn't a political circus, and it's not a courtroom." She paused, her gaze locked, unwavering. Then louder. For the room, for the record, and for the millions watching from their screens. This is where justice is televised nationwide. This is where the truth finally gets a microphone. There it was again, that stillness, that terrible stillness that came not from fear, but from realization. Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned into the silence like it was her witness. You call this political? But what's more political than a pardon drafted not from mercy, not from law, but from strategy? What's more political than choosing to erase a conviction, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient to your base? Her voice dropped again, cold, controlled. You weren't pardoned because you were right. You were pardoned because you were useful. And now finally Arpaio had no slogan, no smirk, no sanctuary. The committee chair's gavel tapped once. Order! But no one moved, because something larger had just shifted. Across the nation, the tape played on every network. Major podcasts interrupted streams mid-episode to break the audio. By morning, legal analysts were demanding authentication. White House press secretaries issued a blanket denial. No knowledge of this recording. No comment. But the internet didn't wait. Voice comparison AI ran in real time. TikTok exploded with side-by-side analysis of speech patterns. That's definitely him, one clip said. That's senior staff. That's strategic language. That's not mercy. That's manipulation. In Phoenix, a group of retired officers posted an open letter. We can no longer defend a man who used our badges to build his brand. The mask is off. In Chicago, a community college canceled classes to host a town hall on state violence. In Miami, a group of high schoolers staged a walkout. Their signs read, "Justice isn't just a word," thanks to Jasmine. But even amid the eruption, Jasmine Crockett never raised her voice, never called for outrage. She sat in her office that night, alone but not lonely, staring at Mateo Jimenez's photo on her desk. Her staff begged her to go live. The DNC asked her to headline a fundraiser. CNN requested an exclusive. She turned them all down. Instead, she opened her laptop and began typing a handwritten letter to Mateo's mother. She ended it with one sentence. He wasn't invisible, and he won't be forgotten. The tape had ended. The whispers had faded. Even the feverish clatter of reporters' keyboards was gone. All that remained was stillness and the sound of a nation's breath being held. Jasmine Crockett sat tall, hands folded lightly before her, eyes fixed not on Joe Arpaio anymore, but on something larger, something heavier. She didn't need to raise her voice. Not now. She spoke quietly, clearly, as if every word she uttered would be carved in stone. "Mr. Arpaio," she began, "you were pardoned from prison, pardoned from sentencing, pardoned from the justice that so many in your custody were never even allowed to seek." Her voice didn't crack. It sharpened, like glass smoothing beneath a flame. But you were not pardoned from memory. You were not pardoned from consequence. And you most certainly are not pardoned from history. She let that linger. Then she reached slowly for a sheet of paper. Not a document, not evidence. Just words. Her own. Written last night. She looked down at it once, then folded it away. Because history is not written in courtrooms. It's written in the hearts of those who survived what the courts ignored. In the scars left by silence. In the children who never got to grow up because your system never saw them as children. Now she looked directly at him. And history, Sheriff Arpaio, is watching you right now. Listening to your every word. Measuring every lie. Recording every time you refuse to say the one thing you never have. I was wrong. A long pause. So no, this isn't revenge. It isn't politics. This is memory. This is justice spoken aloud. And it's happening in real time. Her voice dropped into something even colder, a verdict etched in quiet fury. You were spared a prison cell, but no one can spare you from the story we tell our children about what you did. And that story, she said, begins today. Then she sat back, hands folded, gaze steady. The room didn't erupt. It fell silent. The stillness was not empty, it was overflowing, with things no one could say, with truths too long buried. And for a moment, it wasn't about left or right, politics or headlines. It was just about witnessing, about seeing finally what had always been there. A woman in the gallery, mid-40s, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, wiped tears silently from her cheek. A young man beside her, suit too big for his frame, reached for her hand but never quite touched it. A Capitol police officer, standing near the exit, shifted awkwardly, his own expression tight with something like grief. And then, like lightning in the stillness, came a single sound, a breath caught in a throat. It came from Joe Arpaio. He sat motionless, eyes blank, hands gripping the table edge so tightly his knuckles blanched. The tremor started in his fingers, barely noticeable, but the camera caught it, the one pointed directly at him, broadcasting in high definition to millions. That tremor, the first visible crack, his jaw clenched, then released. He reached for his water, but missed the glass by half an inch. And that somehow said more than any rebuttal ever could. And then it happened. From the back row a man stood, late 50s, face lined with years of silence, skin brown, weathered. He wore a worn-collared shirt, clean but faded, and in his hand he held a folded photo. No media badge, no nameplate. He didn't shout, he just whispered, and the room heard him anyway. Finally, he exhaled the word like a prayer that had waited 2 decades to be spoken. His voice shook as he added, "Someone said it, for all of us." The room didn't break into applause. It didn't need to, because truth doesn't need a microphone when it's finally spoken aloud. Across the country, the footage aired live. Commentators paused, not knowing what to say. Analysts stammered over their scripts. In living rooms from El Paso to Sacramento, people sat with hands over mouths, some crying, others simply frozen. For the first time, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, once America's toughest sheriff, looked small, human, breakable. The man who had built his reputation on toughness now sat in the ruins of his myth, surrounded not by iron bars or police allies, but by silence and truth. In Phoenix, a local news anchor choked up while trying to summarize the scene. She looked down at her notes, then into the camera. "I covered Tent City for 10 years. I interviewed inmates, guards, lawyers. I reported the statistics. But I've never seen a reckoning like this. Today, for the first time, people believed they were heard." In Texas, a high school civics class paused their lesson. The teacher rewound Jasmine's final line 3 times. One girl raised her hand and whispered, "Can I write about this for my college essay?" In D.C., Jasmine Crockett walked slowly out of the chamber, not with triumph, not with applause, but with purpose. Her staff said nothing. They didn't need to. Her silence now carried the weight of every voice that had been silenced before her. And Arpaio? He sat long after the hearing adjourned, alone at the table, his team huddled behind him, whispering legal strategy, press damage control, exit routes. But he didn't respond, because something had finally reached him. Not prosecution, but memory. Fan X. The room had cleared, but the silence she left behind still vibrated in the halls of Congress. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk out like a victor. She walked out like a woman who had just unburied a century of silence and left it in the nation's lap. Behind her, cameras tried to follow. Commentators tried to name the moment. But no soundbite could contain what had just happened. And yet, the ripple became a wave before the sun even rose. By 7:43 a.m., the Department of Justice issued a formal press release. In light of new audio, internal documentation, and sworn congressional testimony, The Civil Rights Division is reopening its investigation into Maricopa County Sheriff's Office practices from 2008 to 2016. The nation blinked, then roared. Reporters swarmed the DOJ gates. Civil rights attorneys took to the airwaves. Old cases, previously dismissed or ignored, were being re-examined within hours. One headline from the New York Times summed it up best. From forgotten to federal, the reckoning begins. But that wasn't all. By noon, attorneys general in 11 states had issued a joint call to re-examine and potentially abolish qualified immunity, the decades-old legal doctrine that had shielded officers like Arpaio from personal accountability. Their argument was simple, brutal, and long overdue. When law becomes a mask, the face underneath must be exposed. In Denver, protesters held signs that read, "Immunity is not innocence." In Boston, city officials held a televised forum with victims of wrongful arrest. In Arizona, Governor Sanchez, once a quiet supporter of Arpaio, released a short statement that sent shockwaves. Silence is complicity. We will no longer be complicit. And above it all, one name was whispered, tweeted, sung, and shouted: Jasmine Crockett. Not for how loud she had spoken, not for theatrics or political flair, but because she had not flinched, not once, not in the face of a legacy built on power, fear, and public spectacle. While others had bent beneath the weight of old systems, she had stood, not shouting, but standing, speaking truth not with rage, but with precision. You were spared a prison cell, but no one can spare you from the story we tell our children about what you did. That line made it into classrooms, onto banners, into law school lectures. But it was her final line, delivered at the edge of silence, that the nation couldn't stop repeating: the law is not armor for the powerful, it is a shield for the powerless. By midnight, those words were everywhere, projected across the Lincoln Memorial in white light, printed in the Atlantic's cover story titled "A New Shield," stitched into protest banners in downtown LA, chanted in Spanish and English by students in New York. On Etsy, someone was already selling a poster with Jasmine's silhouette behind those words. By dawn, it had sold out. But in the Capitol, Jasmine didn't celebrate. She sat in her office, shoes off, eyes tired, watching footage from a town hall in Phoenix. Survivors were standing in a line 3 blocks long to speak, some trembling, some angry, all brave. Her aide came in with a tablet. "CNN wants you on prime time, tonight." Jasmine shook her head. "Let them talk first. The country's just beginning to listen." She didn't want lights. She wanted legacy. And legacy was already happening. In Kansas, a congressman who had once co-sponsored an anti-immigration bill reversed his position. Live. "I watched what happened in that room. I voted wrong before. I'm not going to die on the wrong side of justice." In California, the state bar announced it would review 132 convictions connected to ICE sweeps during the Arpaio years. A nonprofit launched a trauma hotline for former detainees. And in Texas, a school named its new debate hall the Jasmine Crockett Room. But Jasmine didn't post about any of it. She returned to Fort Worth. No cameras, no crowds. She visited the grave of Mateo Jimenez. Alone, no press statement, no flowers. Just a folded piece of paper tucked under the headstone. It read, "You didn't get a day in court, but you got a day in history." 3 days later, the DOJ announced criminal referrals for Arpaio's aides, based on the documents Jasmine had introduced into the record. Congressional leaders began drafting a bill called the Community Protection and Transparency Act, designed to limit federal cooperation with sheriffs under civil rights investigation. Jasmine didn't write it, but it bore her fingerprint in every clause. And still, she stayed silent. Until one Sunday morning, she appeared on Face the Nation, seated calmly in a blue dress, no notes, no talking points. The host asked, "Congresswoman Crockett, what do you say to critics who say this was just a personal takedown of Joe Arpaio?" She looked directly into the camera. "It's never personal when a child dies. It's never personal when families disappear. It's never personal to want justice. It's human. And if we ever lose sight of that, then we don't deserve to lead." The clip trended within minutes. That night, 60 Minutes aired a special called Tent City Truth and Aftermath. One of the closing shots showed a protester holding up a homemade sign. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She didn't run. She stood. And that, in the end, became her greatest act, not shouting over power, but refusing to bow to it. The final gavel had long fallen. Arpaio had been escorted out. The camera crews packed up. The chants outside faded into the night. But long after the screens went dark, the silence Jasmine Crockett left behind kept echoing. Not the silence of defeat, the silence that follows truth, the kind that rearranges the room even after the people have left it, because something had happened that couldn't be edited, dismissed, or ignored. Jasmine didn't just speak truth to power, she disarmed it. Not with volume, not with rage, but with clarity, with composure, with the steady, brutal precision of a woman who had spent her life preparing for the moment she'd finally be allowed to speak without interruption. And when she did, the country leaned in. Not because she screamed, but because she didn't. In the days that followed, political commentators scrambled to define the moment. Pundits searched for labels. Crockett's courtroom masterclass. The fall of the toughest sheriff. History meets its reckoning. But none of those titles captured what it felt like to be there, or to watch it unfold live. Because what Jasmine gave America wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning long denied. And from that reckoning came a lesson, not in politics, but in humanity. We often talk about justice as if it's a building, a courtroom, a badge. But Jasmine reminded us, justice is a person's name being remembered, a lie being confronted, a silence being broken. She showed us that cruelty doesn't always arrive with screaming. Sometimes it comes through bureaucracy, through policies written in cold ink, through handcuffs locked with polite hands, through terms like standard procedure, compliance, and law enforcement discretion. That's how the system hides the pain, by sterilizing it, by cloaking it in language that sounds professional, while destroying people's lives in ways no memo ever admits. But Jasmine peeled back that language. She showed us that what Arpaio called tent housing was exile under canvas in 49-degree heat, that what ICE called processing delays was a 12-year-old boy sleeping on concrete, that what a White House aide once called optics was a mother bearing her son in silence. And she didn't just tell us, she showed us with documents, names, voices, photographs, tears. She taught us that memory isn't a burden, it's a weapon, that facts aren't cold, they're sacred, that if the law does not bend to protect the most vulnerable, it will eventually break the rest of us too. 1 week after the hearing, a classroom in Phoenix played Jasmine's final statement on loop. The students, mostly Black and Latino, sat in stunned silence. One boy raised his hand and asked, "Can truth be loud even when someone whispers it?" The teacher smiled through tears. "That's exactly what it was," she said. "It was a whisper heard around the world." In Sacramento, a group of protest organizers read aloud the names of 75 detainees who had died in custody under Arpaio's policies. They lit candles. One woman, a former tent city guard who had turned whistleblower, stepped to the mic and said, "We enforced fear." She enforced truth. In El Paso, a mural appeared overnight. It showed Jasmine standing in front of a courtroom podium. Behind her, faces, hundreds, faint outlines of people once detained, now no longer invisible. At the bottom it read, "Truth doesn't need to scream, it just needs to survive." But the human lesson didn't stop at public memory. It seeped into institutions. Churches began hosting workshops on legal empathy, understanding the human cost behind every statute. Law schools revised their syllabi, including a unit on the Arpaio hearings under the label Justice versus Justification. Activist groups started teaching young people how to request body cam footage, how to document sweeps, how to demand truth even when systems prefer silence. And Jasmine? She declined the talk show tours. She turned down the Vanity Fair cover. Instead, she did something no one expected. She went back to the communities Arpaio had damaged. Quietly, no cameras, no headlines. She held a town hall in Guadalupe, Arizona, a town of 5,000 that had been targeted during racial profiling sweeps. She sat with elders who had buried cousins and sons. She hugged a woman who carried her brother's mugshot in her wallet. She answered questions from children. She listened to stories no one else had written down. And in that listening, she gave a different kind of justice, one without gavels, but with eyes that didn't flinch. What Jasmine Crockett gave America wasn't just a moment, it was a reminder that justice is not a courtroom, it's a conversation, that the law is not a fortress, it's a promise. And if we let that promise be worn only by those with power, it becomes armor. But if we build it with truth, it becomes a shield. Her final words, now quoted on billboards, on law journals, on protest signs across every coast, are still echoing. The law is not armor for the powerful, it is a shield for the powerless. That's the human lesson. And it is not finished. Because every time someone speaks up against cruelty, the echo grows. Every time someone tells a name the system forgot, the silence shrinks. Every time someone stands when the powerful enter the room, the myth of invincibility shatters a little more. And one day when the next Jasmine walks into the next room built to crush her, she'll already know. She doesn't have to raise her voice. She just has to raise her truth. But a story, no matter how powerful, is only memory unless it moves us. Jasmine Crockett stood her ground. She exposed what others covered. She faced down a system that devours the weak and protects the bold-faced. But she cannot stand alone forever. Because justice is not a moment, it's a movement. And movements need more than witnesses. They need participants. So now the camera turns, not to Jasmine, to you. You who watched and felt that chill when a 12-year-old boy's name was spoken. You who clenched your fists when the pardon became a political bargaining chip. You who thought, this is not my fight, but now understand that silence is not neutral. You who carry a badge. You who once wore a uniform. You who teach, who vote, who scroll, who post. This is where you come in, because systems do not change when truth is spoken once. They change when truth is repeated louder by those who once whispered. They change when laws are not just challenged by lawyers, but by citizens who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. So ask yourself, will you allow laws to be used as shields for power, or will you help forge them into protection for the vulnerable? Will you vote for policies that punish the voiceless, or demand reforms that restore dignity? Will you walk past the tents, the fences, the jails built in the name of order? Or will you ask who they were built to contain? Because this is not about Joe Arpaio. It's not even just about Mateo Jimenez. It's about who we become when no one's watching. So call your representatives. Demand accountability. Join coalitions pushing to end qualified immunity. Volunteer legal aid to the undocumented. Film what they hope no one sees. Share what they tried to bury. And when the next courtroom opens, when the next name is read, when the next silence begs to be broken, be the voice that does not tremble. Jasmine Crockett lit the fire. Now it's ours to carry. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a fiery congressional showdown, Jasmine Crockett dared to call out racial injustice in healthcare. But Ronnie Jackson laughed in her face. He mocked her stories, insulted her intelligence, and called racial health disparities a myth. But Jasmine didn't just push back. She dropped the names of the forgotten dead, victims of a system built to ignore them. What happened next sent shockwaves through Congress, ignited a national reckoning, and pushed Jackson's career to the edge of collapse. So what did Jasmine say that turned the room from laughter to dead silence? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The clock struck 9 a.m. sharp when the heavy double doors of the Oversight Committee hearing room creaked open. Inside, the temperature felt colder than the air conditioning could explain. This was no ordinary session. Today's hearing, titled Equity in Post-COVID Recovery and Veterans Healthcare, had already sent shockwaves through Washington. Cameras clicked like distant gunfire as Congressman Ronnie Jackson entered first, his navy lapel pin gleaming, his gait sharp, unapologetically smug. He shook hands with fellow Republicans, nodding to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan like a quarterback walking into a locker room before the big game. Jackson wasn't here to listen. He was here to dominate. He tossed his notes on the mahogany table with a thud and leaned back, exuding the aura of a man convinced that expertise equaled infallibility. His eyes briefly scanned the room, settling on the empty chair across from him, Jasmine Crockett's seat, and then she appeared. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the room with the kind of quiet intensity that made men look twice and shift uncomfortably. Her heels echoed with defiance on the marble floor, a dark blazer perfectly fitted, capping shoulders that had carried more injustice than most could survive. In her hand, a worn leather folder stuffed with data, affidavits, names, dates, lives. Her other hand adjusted sleek black glasses that mirrored the flash of every camera, but hid something deeper. Fire. As she approached the table, she didn't glance left or right. She didn't need to. The target was clear. The battle lines were drawn. Ronnie Jackson looked up, and for a fraction of a second blinked. This wasn't just another Democrat. This was a woman who came from the ashes of racial erasure, systemic neglect, and public health failure. And she had come armed, with truth and rage sharpened into precision. And in that blink, the room changed. Gone was the illusion of routine politics. What remained was the raw tension between two forces hurtling toward collision. On one side sat Ronnie Jackson, former Rear Admiral, White House physician, and bulldog loyalist of Donald Trump. Medals lined his resume, but so did controversy, accused of downplaying PTSD diagnoses, of brushing off long-term COVID data, of treating science like a political baton rather than a beacon. To him, this hearing was theater, and he came prepared to play the lead. His worldview was forged in hierarchy, orders given, questions silenced. His truth was uniformed, white-coated, and insulated from the cries of broken systems. He spoke for numbers, not names. He dismissed nuance, especially when wrapped in black skin or buried in poor zip codes. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, whose very presence ruptured that worldview like a scalpel through old scar tissue. A civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, she bore no medals, only memories. She knew what it meant to hold a mother's hand outside an ER and explain why her baby didn't make it. She had stood in morgues and forgotten clinics, in courtrooms where justice was just another word for delay. Her expertise wasn't born in war zones overseas. It was earned in America's medical deserts, where being black or poor meant your pain had to scream to be believed. Jackson spoke for control. Crockett spoke for those who had none. He came with rank. She came with purpose sharpened into something lethal, accountability. And this room, silent now, would soon have to choose which truth it could stomach. And just as the silence stretched long enough to feel sacred, Ronnie Jackson leaned forward and shattered it like glass, with the ease of a man too used to never being questioned. His hands rested confidently on the polished oak desk, fingertips tapping as if counting down to provocation. The microphone caught the faint rustle of his papers, but his voice sliced through the air, smooth and deliberate, laced with contempt wrapped in professionalism. "Let me be absolutely clear for the record," he began, tone rehearsed like a man who'd spent a lifetime speaking without fear of contradiction. "This committee, this administration, frankly, has become obsessed with pouring billions into what they call health equity." He made finger quotes in the air. "But what it really is a social justice fantasy, a bottomless pit for taxpayer dollars, a solution in search of a problem." He leaned back, scanning the room like a teacher daring his students to disagree. "We're here talking about how to fix a system that isn't broken. What's broken is the mindset, the narrative, the idea that somehow race, not personal choices, not family structure, not economic accountability, is why certain groups experience worse health outcomes." His eyes, cold and certain, flicked toward Jasmine with surgical precision. "What we need is discipline, not drama, science, not sociology dressed up as science." Across from him, Jasmine had slowly lifted a thick chart from her folder, its title printed in bold. "Black Maternal Mortality in the United States, CDC 2023. The numbers were undeniable. The image, 3 red bars towering over pale blue, wasn't theater. It was truth, backed by data. But Jackson never glanced at it. He didn't need to, because what he was really dismissing wasn't the chart, it was her. He chuckled, low and patronizing, before delivering the line that would hang in the air like smoke in a burning building. Congresswoman Crockett, do you actually have a medical degree? Or is this just something you read on BuzzFeed between protests? The sound in the chamber changed. Not silence, but tension, like the breath just before a scream, or the stillness before glass shatters. Chairs shifted. Pens froze mid-sentence. The insult wasn't just personal, it was systemic. A lifetime of belittlement distilled into 12 words. He hadn't merely questioned her expertise, he'd ridiculed her legitimacy. As a lawmaker, a black woman, and an advocate for lives his charts didn't even count. And Jasmine didn't flinch. Not yet. But a vein pulsed at her temple. Her lips pressed into a hard, silent line. The look in her eyes said everything. You've insulted the wrong woman, and you have no idea what's coming. And for one long, breathless moment, it seemed like Jasmine Crockett might strike back with fury. She had every right to. Every muscle in her jaw had tightened the moment Ronnie Jackson mocked her chart. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table with such force that her knuckles paled against her skin. The insult, the smirk, the BuzzFeed jab wasn't just a personal swipe. It was centuries of dismissal condensed into one smug sentence. She had heard that tone before, in courtrooms and hospitals and faculty lounges. It was the tone that said, "You're here because we let you be here. Don't forget your place." But Jasmine didn't explode. She didn't shout, didn't lean forward or fire back with the sharp sarcasm that many in the room were bracing for. Instead, she inhaled, deeply, deliberately, as if dragging air through every inch of history resting on her shoulders. And then she leaned into her microphone, slowly, and began to speak. Not like a politician, not like someone defending herself, but like someone bearing witness. "You want to talk about credentials, Doctor Jackson?" she said, her voice calm but resonant, the kind that made you listen even if you didn't want to. "You want to know if I have a medical degree? No, I don't. I have something else." She paused long enough for the room to realize they were about to hear something that couldn't be fact-checked, couldn't be spun. Something real. "I have the funeral program of my best friend," she said. "Tamika Johnson, 26 years old, first pregnancy, college graduate. She went to her OBGYN 3 times in her 3rd trimester, complaining of headaches, blurry vision, swelling. They gave her Tylenol, told her to rest, sent her home." A rustle moved through the chamber, not from Jasmine, but from those listening. Her voice wasn't shaking, but there was weight in every syllable, like each word was being carried from the depth of her chest. "She went into labor early. Blood pressure was sky high when she arrived, but they were short-staffed. No one rechecked her vitals for 4 hours. No one noticed she was slipping, until she coded." Silence. You could hear the faint hum of the air vents, the soft clack of someone's wedding ring nervously tapping the underside of a desk. Jasmine looked up for the first time, not at her Democratic colleagues, not at the cameras, but straight at Ronnie Jackson. She died because no one caught the preeclampsia, because no one listened when she said her head felt like it was splitting open, because she was a black woman in a system that treats black pain as exaggeration and black bodies as afterthoughts. She reached down into her folder and pulled out a photograph, slightly bent at the corners. Tamika's face beamed from it, radiant, full of promise, her hand gently cradling her baby bump. Jasmine held the photo in the air, then placed it on the table in front of her like it was evidence in a courtroom. And it was. She wasn't a statistic. She was my friend. She was a daughter, a sister, a church choir leader, and she's dead. Her voice didn't rise. That was the power. She didn't have to yell. Every word landed like a stone on glass. "You talk about taxpayer dollars like they're more precious than people. Like what we're doing here is throwing money into a woke abyss. But I want to ask you something, Dr. Jackson." Her voice was colder now, sharper. "How much is Tamika's life worth? Can you put that on a line item? Is there a number for what her mother would pay just to hear her laugh again?" She paused. Because when you mock the need for health equity, when you roll your eyes at charts, when you call these investments fantasy, you're telling every mother who lost a daughter that their grief is political theater. You're telling me that Tamika's death was her fault. At that, several staffers lowered their eyes. One of the female aides covered her mouth with her hand, blinking fast. "I'm not standing here asking you for sympathy," Jasmine continued. "I'm asking you for recognition. Recognition that the system you swore an oath to serve has cracks so wide that people like Tamika fall through them every single day. And then you come in here and call our attempts to fix it fantasy." She picked up the photo again, held it chest high. This is the cost of your fantasy. And unlike your numbers, Dr. Jackson, this doesn't lie. No one spoke. Even Jackson, who had earlier lounged in his chair like the hearing was beneath him, now sat stiff, one hand resting near his tie, the other clenched under the table. Jasmine took one final breath and delivered the blow that no chart could match. "You asked if I have a medical degree. No, what I have is a lifetime of watching people who look like me die sooner, suffer longer, and be told it's just a coincidence. What I have is clarity. And if you can't accept that, then maybe you're the one who should sit down and listen." And then she stopped. She didn't add anything. She didn't need to. The weight of what she had said stretched across the room like a thundercloud. No one reached for a water bottle. No one whispered to their aides. Even the committee chair, a Republican, stared at his desk in stunned silence. Jasmine slowly returned the photo to her folder, as if laying Tamika to rest one more time. Her hands were steady, her spine straight. And in that moment, the hearing room didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like a reckoning. The silence that followed Jasmine's final sentence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Like the dead calm after a lightning strike, it held weight, danger, and the crackle of something shifting. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She didn't come to this hearing to share one story. She came with proof, layered, undeniable, and razor sharp. She reached back into her folder, the one Jackson had dismissed earlier as political theater, and began to lay down document after document, each with the cold, clinical precision of a prosecutor building a case. "Since my credentials have been questioned," she began, tone icy but composed, "let me present the data your colleagues never mention." Her fingers tapped on the table once, firmly, then held up the first page. "CDC Report 2023. Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. Not because of genetics, because of systemic failure." She didn't pause for permission. She kept going. "NIH Analysis 2022. Patients of color are less likely to receive pain medication in emergency rooms, even when reporting identical symptoms. Johns Hopkins, 2021. Black veterans have higher rates of undiagnosed hypertension and diabetes despite visiting the VA at the same rate as white veterans." She let each citation fall like a gavel. The committee room, once filled with side whispers and clicking pens, had gone still again. Not out of boredom, but out of reckoning. This is not anecdotal. This is peer-reviewed. This is the government's own data. Jasmine stepped up the intensity, not in volume, but in the power of restraint. "You want science? Here it is. Line by line, table by table. If you're uncomfortable, good. Because for decades, comfort is the very thing that allowed this crisis to stay invisible." She flipped to a page and held it up high. "This chart shows that Black newborns are more than twice as likely to die in hospitals when cared for by white doctors compared to Black doctors. That's not a headline. That's a published study in PNAS." Her gaze never wavered. "Tell me, Dr. Jackson, is that woke science? Or are those dead babies just statistics?" But just when it felt like Jasmine's words had finally forced the room to reckon with a reality too long ignored, Ronnie Jackson shifted, not in panic, but in calculation. His jaw tightened as he adjusted his blazer, then leaned forward with the kind of cold calm that only comes from years of learning how to reframe, deflect, and deny. His fingers laced together, elbows planted like a fortress behind the microphone. "I understand the emotion behind what the Congresswoman is saying," he began, voice coated with forced civility. But with all due respect, we have to be responsible here. Just because two things happen at the same time, race and health disparities, doesn't mean one causes the other. There it was, the pivot, the classic maneuver. With a few carefully chosen phrases, he tried to turn centuries of data into a coincidence. We have to look at this through a broader lens, he continued. There are countless factors that impact health outcomes. Diet, education, community infrastructure, family structure, even individual decisions about lifestyle. He glanced around the room, trying to reclaim the high ground under the guise of complexity. It's reductive, he said, to blame race. What we're seeing are environmental and socioeconomic patterns, not proof of some grand racist machine. That's just not supported by the data. The room, still fragile from the gravity of Jasmine's testimony, felt a new kind of tension, like watching someone try to shove a lid back on a boiling pot. Jackson smiled faintly, almost like a professor correcting a student. But what he didn't see, what he refused to see, was that Jasmine hadn't come here to argue theory. She came carrying names, lives, and grief wrapped in receipts, and she was not about to let him off that easily. Her chair didn't move, her voice didn't spike, she didn't lean in or raise a finger, but the shift in the room was seismic. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with focus so sharp it could split atoms. "Let me see if I understand you correctly," she said, voice controlled like a blade unsheathed slowly. "You're suggesting that Black mothers like Tamika died, not because of systemic failure, but because of where they lived or how they ate. That Black veterans are dying younger and being diagnosed later, not because of bias, but because of their families." Her words were simple, but each one landed with weight, because they demanded more than reaction. They demanded accountability. "Dr. Jackson, if you're going to use science to dismiss pain, then I'm going to use science to prove it exists. Loud, clear, undeniable." She lifted the CDC chart again, this time not to display it, but to confront him with it. These are not isolated stories. These are not mistakes in a few hospitals. This is a pattern, a predictable one, across states, across incomes, across generations. She laid the paper flat on the table and pressed her palm against it like she was anchoring the truth in place. Her voice lowered, but the power behind it surged. "You want to call it socioeconomic? Go ahead. But explain to me why socioeconomic disadvantage looks so much like my skin color. Why you can chart the life expectancy of Black Americans on a map and it matches redline neighborhoods from 70 years ago. Why Black babies are more likely to die even when their mothers have college degrees, even when they have insurance, even when they follow every rule this country claims to set." She took a breath, not for herself, but to let the room catch up. And then she went further. "Do you know what it feels like, Dr. Jackson, to sit in an ER and know they're not hearing you? To explain symptoms and watch the doctor glance at the clock instead of your face? To have your vitals taken like a formality, not a lifeline?" Her voice cracked, but not from weakness. It cracked like thunder. "You can talk about data responsibility all you want, but people like me, people like Tamika, we live in the outcomes of your indifference." Now, even the Republican aides weren't typing. One of them, mid-30s, white shirt, navy tie, looked down at his hands as if trying to disappear. Jasmine pushed forward, still steady. "And let me be absolutely clear. This isn't about blaming every doctor or shaming every institution. It's about stopping the denial. It's about naming the rot so we can finally cut it out. Because until people like you stop pretending that racism has to be intentional to be real, this system will keep killing people who look like me." She let the silence return, not to rest, but to echo. Because some truths don't need repeating, they just need space to land. And just when it seemed Jasmine's words had already cracked the foundation of the hearing, just when the room had settled into a stunned, heavy silence, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift occurred behind her. A staffer, no older than 30, stood from his seat with a calmness that felt rehearsed but resolute. His name wasn't known to the cameras. He didn't command attention with title or presence. But the object in his hand, a small black digital recorder, held the potential to tilt the balance of the room. "Madam Chair," he said clearly, though his voice trembled ever so slightly at the edges. "We'd like to submit an audio recording into the official record." Heads turned. A murmur swept across the gallery like dry leaves in wind. Uncertain, hushed, bracing. The chair hesitated, just long enough for tension to thicken like fog. "Proceed," he said finally. The staffer pressed play. At first, the audio was simple background noise. Papers rustling, distant laughter, a half-muted cough. But then, unmistakably, Ronnie Jackson's voice emerged. Calm, confident, off guard in the way only people speaking behind closed doors can be. "Don't waste money on those areas," he said. "They don't vote for us anyway." Another pause, then a casual chuckle. "Let them fix their own communities if they care that much. Or maybe they'll vote red next time." The words didn't land like an explosion. They landed like a slow, cold wave, swallowing the room inch by inch. For 2 full seconds, no one moved. Then, like a switch had been flipped, the energy snapped. Gasps rippled through the gallery. One reporter dropped their phone trying to hit record. Aides looked at each other, wide-eyed, as if waiting for someone else to confirm what they'd heard. A Republican congressman 2 seats down instinctively leaned back from Jackson, as though physical distance might shield him from the fallout. Even the stenographer, trained to remain neutral, mechanical, looked up from her keys, visibly shaken. The chair banged his gavel once. Then again, louder. His voice, usually steady, cracked under the weight of the moment. "This committee is in recess. 5 minutes. 5 minutes only. Everyone hold your position or clear the room. No more statements until we verify the source." But it was already too late. The court of public opinion had heard enough, and Ronnie Jackson knew it. He shot up from his seat like he'd been lit from underneath. His face was red, not from shame, but fury. The calculated stillness he'd worn all morning shattered into something frantic, something raw and unfiltered. "This is a lie," he roared, pointing directly at Jasmine and her team. "This is fake. It's a deep fake. You think you can ruin a man's career with a cheap audio clip cooked up in a back room?" No one interrupted him. He didn't wait for validation. He was unraveling too quickly to notice. "This is a political hit job," he continued. "It's an ambush, a trap, a setup from the same people who've been after Trump from day one." His hands trembled, not with weakness, but the volatile rage of a man who felt the walls closing in. "You people have no respect for the truth, no respect for service. I gave 30 years to this country, and now I'm being crucified over some clipped audio from God knows where?" He turned toward the committee chair, as if begging for an ally. "Mr. Chairman, are we really going to let this circus continue? This is how reputations are destroyed. This is how you burn down institutions." But the chairman didn't answer. He was conferring in a low voice with legal counsel, eyes darting between the speaker and the transcript that had just been printed on the table. He didn't need to say anything. His silence said it all. Jackson's chest rose and fell, erratic, as the realization crept in. Not just that the words were out there, but that people believed them. The damage had already metastasized. Staffers were tweeting. Phones were vibrating across desks. Every second he spoke now only poured gasoline on a fire already licking at the walls of his credibility. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She didn't stand. She didn't smile or react in any way that could be construed as satisfaction. She just watched him unravel the way men with unchecked power do when finally cornered by truth they can't suppress and a voice they can't talk over. And as the gavel slammed and the hearing was forced into recess, Jasmine Crockett didn't even have to speak again. The world had already begun speaking for her. The clip, 3 minutes and 27 seconds, was posted on C-SPAN's official feed within the hour. But it didn't stay confined to government nerds and policy wonks. A low-res screen recording with shaky subtitles hit Twitter first. Then came the TikTok duets, the YouTube commentary, the side-by-side analysis. Within hours, it was everywhere. Jasmine staring Jackson down, her voice clear, unflinching. The photo of Tamika lay gently on the table. And then, the audio. That calm, off-the-record voice saying, "Don't waste money on those areas. They don't vote for us anyway." By the 6th hour, Washa's Tamika Wasriel was trending globally. By the 12th, the clip had been viewed over 7 million times. By the 24th, it had shattered 15 million. Not because of algorithms, not because of celebrity shares, but because people saw themselves in Jasmine's silence, in her restraint, in her fury that didn't need fire to burn. And then came the wave no spin doctor could prepare for. One by one, the people whose pain had been hidden by charts began to speak. Not politicians, not pundits, but patients, nurses, paramedics, former military medics who had worked inside VA clinics. They flooded Instagram Live and Facebook Watch. They filmed shaky videos in parked cars, still in scrubs. Elderly black men in wheelchairs, holding up folders filled with denied VA claims. Latina mothers who had bled for hours in ER waiting rooms, while white women were seen first. A young veteran crying in his car, describing how a doctor had brushed off his chest pain as anxiety, only to find out a year later he'd already had 2 silent heart attacks. They didn't need scripts. Their pain was the script. "I was Tamika," one woman said through tears. "I treated Tamikas for 30 years, said a retired ER nurse. "They told me it was all in my head," said a man with a surgical scar running from his collarbone to his belly. Hashtags erupted like wildfire. Number YAMTAMIKA. Justice in healthcare. Listen to her. By day 2, these weren't just social media trends. They were national conversations. MSNBC opened with it. CNN brought in healthcare analysts. The New York Times ran a front-page feature titled, "How One Congresswoman Forced a Reckoning on Medical Racism." But in the eye of the storm stood Ronnie Jackson, and he wasn't going to surrender without a fight. The next evening, he walked into a Fox News studio with the air of a man wronged, not guilty. The lighting was sharp, cold, designed to cast him in a war-zone palette of blues and grays. He wore his military lapel pin. The host, seated across from him, gave him a softball intro. Decorated Navy doctor, former White House physician, now under attack. Jackson leaned into the camera, voice perfectly modulated for outrage. "What we're witnessing is the complete weaponization of race and outrage by the radical left. They took a line I said in a closed-door budget meeting, without context, and twisted it to make me look like a monster." He didn't blink. "I have served under 3 presidents. I've treated combat wounds in Iraq. I've held the hands of dying soldiers in the field. And now they want to destroy me because I questioned a flawed political narrative." He exhaled slowly, calculated, playing to the loyal base he knew would hear it. "This is a witch hunt. It's not about healthcare. It's about control. They don't want people like me asking hard questions." He paused, then added the line that would headline Breitbart by morning. "They're not coming after me because I'm wrong. They're coming after me because I don't kneel." But outside the frame, beyond the bright lights of the studio and the safe space of conservative punditry, the narrative was slipping through his fingers. Because no matter how polished his talking points were, he couldn't out-talk 15 million pairs of eyes who had already seen the truth for themselves. And Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't tweeted once. She hadn't posted a video, issued a statement, or called a press conference. She didn't need to, because the truth was speaking for her now, through the voices of every person who'd ever sat in a hospital waiting room and felt invisible, through every family who had buried someone too soon and been told, "We did all we could," through every medical form left unread, every ignored symptom, every sigh from a doctor who didn't believe you. She had lit the match, and now the fire was revealing everything that had been hidden. But as the roar outside Capitol Hill turned into a national reckoning, as stories poured in from emergency rooms and VA clinics, from broken homes and broken bodies, inside the marble walls of Congress, the temperature dropped. The fire Jasmine Crockett had ignited in public had unsettled too many comfortable men in private. And so, behind closed doors, far from cameras and microphones, the machinery of backlash began to turn. It didn't come in the form of open denial or televised outrage. It came in the oldest form Washington knows, a document. 48 hours after her testimony went viral, a coalition of Republican lawmakers, led by a senior representative from Florida and backed quietly by 2 subcommittee chairmen, filed a formal resolution with the House Clerk's office. The title sounded benign: Request for verification of data sources presented before the Oversight Committee on Health Equity and Veteran Affairs. But the intent wasn't benign, it was surgical. They weren't attacking Jasmine's story, they were attacking her credibility, line by line, reference by reference. The resolution called for a comprehensive audit of every study, chart, and citation she'd used in the hearing. The CDC maternal mortality report, the NIH pain management disparities study, the VA's internal review on racial bias and triage. Even the PNAS peer-reviewed article on infant mortality was listed for methodological scrutiny. And the justification? Congresswoman Crockett has introduced emotionally charged narratives that may not fully reflect the complexity of the data. In the interest of objectivity and public trust, a review is necessary. It was cloaked in the language of fairness, but underneath it was an unmistakable effort to discredit her voice under the guise of due diligence. They weren't questioning the data because it was flawed. They were questioning it because it was too powerful, because it had already moved the public, because it had already started to reshape the national conversation, because it came from her. The resolution was hand-delivered to Jasmine's office in a sealed folder with a golden congressional crest. Her chief of staff handed it to her without a word. Jasmine sat at her desk, flipping it open under the dim lamp glow that made her office feel less like a workspace and more like a war bunker. She read every word, every footnote, every name on the signatory page. She didn't react, didn't curse, didn't stand. But something in her changed. She closed the folder with both hands slowly and pressed her palms against the top as if grounding herself through the paper. "They think data is just numbers," she said finally, voice low. "But behind every number I cited is someone who's already buried their Tamika." Her staff was silent, not because they didn't know what to say, but because they knew what came next. And the cruelty of it all was that they weren't even trying to refute the truth. They were just trying to drown it in paperwork, drag it into committee, weaken it by delay, muffle it beneath procedures, amendments, and endless reviews. They didn't want to disprove the pain. They just wanted to outlast it. Emails followed within the hour, from the committee clerk's office, from the Office of Congressional Ethics, from the House Science and Technology Subcommittee, all requesting clarification, sources, cross-reference backup materials. Jasmine's team was given 72 hours to submit every cited document in its original form, plus internal notes and communications used to prepare her testimony. A Republican aide off the record was overheard saying, "We'll drown her in her own footnotes." And yet Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't lash out on social media. She didn't go on a press tour. She didn't even respond to the resolution right away. Instead, she stood in her office late that night, staring at the Washington skyline, the dome of the Capitol glowing in sterile white light, and said softly to herself, "If they want to audit my facts, fine. I'll give them more than they asked for." Because Jasmine understood what they hadn't. When power tries to bury you in process, the only answer is to turn the process into a weapon. And as Jasmine Crockett's name echoed through the marble halls, not in scandal, but in strength, what began as a moment of confrontation became a movement of transformation. The firestorm had spread far beyond any hearing room. While her opponents tried to drown her in bureaucratic noise, something far more powerful had begun to emerge from the silence they left behind. Not just applause, not just admiration, but legislation. Within days, a draft began circulating among Democratic leadership. It started in quiet emails between committee staffers, then gained momentum through private briefings and closed-door sessions. The name on the header? The Crockett Health Equity Act. It wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. The bill proposed something no Congress had ever dared to codify at this scale: a federally mandated investigation into racial disparities in healthcare delivery across every major federal system, Medicaid, Medicare, the VA, and more. It called for the Department of Health and Human Services to publish annual disparity reports. It would require that the CDC and NIH track outcomes by race and zip code, not as a suggestion, but as law. And most critically, it would establish a permanent office for racial equity in public health, with the power to enforce reforms. This wasn't a gesture, it was a gauntlet. The bill's language was sharp, surgical. It didn't ask Congress to believe an anecdote. It demanded that it reckon with data. In its preamble were not just the statistics, but names. Tamika Johnson among them, listed as an emblem of every preventable death buried under the phrase complications. And in the final lines, clear as crystal, this act is named in honor of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, whose testimony revealed a systemic truth long denied. Even some centrist Democrats, long wary of alienating conservative districts, signed on, because the public was watching now. Voters weren't asking about abstract policies anymore. They were asking, where was this when my mother wasn't believed? Why did my son have to wait 6 hours while others were seen first? The bill had support not just in Congress, but in communities that had felt invisible for generations. And then came the letters. They didn't arrive all at once. They arrived like memory, slow, painful, and relentless. From Black veterans, Latino medics, Native American patients, Filipino nurses. Some were handwritten, scrawled in shaky cursive. Others were typed in all caps by men who had lost their sight to diabetes or war. Some came with photos, others with death certificates, and every single one told a story the system had tried to forget. One came from a retired Marine in Georgia. I served in 2 wars, but the hardest battle was getting someone to believe me when I said my chest hurt. They said it was stress. By the time they ran a scan, it was too late. My left ventricle was already damaged. Another came from a mother in Oakland, her son's folded flag still on the mantle. My son made it home. But when his liver began failing, they kept postponing appointments. Said the backlog was long. Said it wasn't urgent. He was 29. And another from a nurse who had worked inside the VA for 30 years. I saw it with my own eyes, the way the tone changed when it was a Black patient, the way complaints were labeled as non-compliant instead of underserved. We weren't allowed to say bias, so we called it workflow issues. But we knew. Within a week, over 3,400 letters had been cataloged and archived by Jasmine's staff. They created a digital map, red dots for every city, every rural town, every military base that had submitted a story. It looked like a constellation of the unheard. And then the flood intensified. 67 retired officers, some of them highly decorated, sent a joint letter addressed directly to the Speaker of the House. Typed on official letterhead, signed with military precision, and loaded with a simple but thunderous demand. We formally request that Congress reopen a full-scale review of the Veterans Affairs System's treatment of veterans of color. We request that this committee hold new hearings, not for political gain, but because justice delayed is justice denied, even in uniform. The letter didn't beg, it stood. It called out decades of silent discrimination wrapped in bureaucratic language. It pointed to disparities in disability ratings, mental health access, PTSD treatment, and pain medication approvals. And it ended with a sentence that rattled even the most hardened lawmakers. We were willing to die for this country. Now we ask it to finally treat us as if we lived. The moment hit Washington like a tidal wave. Suddenly, even those who had dismissed Jasmine as emotional, dramatic, or unprofessional were scrambling to reassess. Not because they changed their minds, but because the country had. Cable news couldn't ignore it anymore. CNN ran the story for 3 straight nights. NPR hosted veterans reading their own letters live. The Atlantic published a cover titled, "The Reckoning That Jasmine Sparked." Even conservative outlets were forced to cover it, some mocking, others conceding, the pressure is real. And Jasmine, she said nothing for 3 days, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew the silence was doing the work for her. But the cameras didn't cut right away. The CNN anchor, normally polished and poised, sat frozen for a second too long. Jasmine's words had cut through the format of the show, through the scripts, through the glass and steel of the studio walls. This wasn't politics. This was survival, dignity, and resistance, spoken not in outrage, but in exhausted, impenetrable truth. She didn't cry. She didn't soften. She simply let the silence linger. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. The nation heard her. Clips of the interview exploded across every platform within the hour, not in echo chambers, not in filtered feeds, but in real emotional ripples. A nurse in Baltimore watched it in the hospital break room, turned to her colleague and whispered, "She's saying everything we've lived." A Vietnam veteran sitting in a trailer outside Tulsa posted the clip on Facebook with the caption, "Maybe someone's finally fighting for us." A 19-year-old pre-med student in Oakland stitched the video on TikTok with tears in her eyes. "This is why I study. This is why I fight." The clip wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, and that's why it pierced deeper than any press conference ever could. Back in Washington, the impact wasn't just emotional, it was seismic. 3 more Democrats co-sponsored the Crockett Health Equity Act overnight. Then a surprising 4th name appeared, Republican, Texas, a veteran himself. Not loud about it, just a quiet line added to the bill's co-sponsor list. But that was enough to shake the dome. By noon the next day, conservative media turned on him. Traitor, sellout, another Reno Falls. And yet something had shifted, because while the threats continued to flood Jasmine's inbox, now numbering over 1,000, some accompanied by doctored images and deepfakes, so did something else, support in its rawest form. Hundreds of people, most of them strangers, sent physical letters to her office, some with no return address, many with trembling handwriting. One from a black woman in Birmingham read, "When I heard your voice on CNN, I felt like someone had finally walked into the room where we were bleeding and said, 'I see you.'" Another came from a high schooler in El Paso. "I want to be like you, not because you're fearless, but because you fight even when you're afraid." And perhaps the most haunting of all, a simple note written on VA stationery in block letters from a man in hospice care. "I won't live to see the bill passed, but thank you for trying. Please keep trying." Meanwhile, the security detail around Jasmine intensified. She was now escorted to every event. Her car was swapped every 48 hours. Her home address had been scrubbed from every online database her team could find. She carried a panic button now, and still she showed up to every meeting, every committee, every floor vote. Glass or no glass, threats or no threats. She was done negotiating with fear. And then on a cold Thursday morning, something snapped the story open again. Capitol Police arrested a man loitering near the south entrance of the Rayburn building. In his backpack, zip ties, a knife, and printed screenshots of Jasmine's testimony. He had been flagged online days earlier, an extremist forum known for inciting political violence. His post called her the real domestic threat. When questioned, he said he was just scouting. The arrest made national news. This time, even members of Congress who had stayed silent were forced to speak. Some issued statements of solidarity, generic, cautious. Others, real ones, walked across the aisle and stood behind her in front of the press. One Republican, voice shaking, admitted on camera, "We may disagree on policy, but threatening someone's life because they demand equity? That's not conservatism. That's terrorism." But Jasmine, she didn't hold a press conference. She held a vigil. On the Capitol steps that Friday night, she stood with a candle in one hand and her folder of Tamika's story in the other. No podium, no microphones. Just her and a circle of volunteers, nurses, veterans, and staffers who had shown up uninvited one by one until the crowd numbered in the hundreds. She didn't deliver a speech. She read names, 30 names, real people, dead too soon, denied care, misdiagnosed, unheard. And when she finished, she said just one thing: "I'm not afraid of the glass, I'm afraid of silence." And just when it seemed the firestorm might finally subside, after the arrests, the interviews, the candlelit vigils, a new summons shattered the calm. Ronnie Jackson had been called back to testify. This time, not as a policymaker, not as a defender of the status quo, but as a subject of investigation. The charges were not criminal, yet, but they were damning. Over a dozen veteran nurses had come forward in the weeks following Jasmine's televised speech. They were scattered across states, Texas, Alabama, Michigan, but their stories were chillingly similar. They had all worked under Jackson in various federal medical facilities, primarily within VA systems, and they all alleged the same pattern, that he had consistently dismissed, delayed, or outright ignored PTSD evaluations for veterans of color, especially black men. One nurse submitted a sworn affidavit. He told me once, "These guys always think they've got PTSD. What they need is a job and a clock to punch." Another wrote, "He said trauma was being overdiagnosed, but he never said that to white veterans. Only the black ones." The oversight committee moved swiftly. The media caught wind of the summons, and within 72 hours, the hearing was scheduled. This time, Jasmine Crockett would not be questioning. She would be testifying. The hearing room was packed before the gavel struck. There were no open seats, not even in the overflow chamber. Veterans lined the walls in silence, wearing medals on jackets worn thin from time. Nurses in scrubs stood near the back, holding folders thick with testimony. Capitol Police stood 2 deep along the entryway. This wasn't just political anymore. This was historic. Jackson sat at the witness table with his attorney. His eyes scanned the room, but they didn't settle. He looked less like a defiant warrior this time, and more like a man who finally realized the tide had turned and was not waiting for permission to crash. Jasmine walked in last. She wore a deep blue suit, tailored sharp. No jewelry, no notes. Her face was unreadable. The chair cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, you've been asked to provide sworn testimony regarding your previous allegations and your review of the submitted complaints. You may proceed." She stood, adjusted the microphone. Then she spoke. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "I want to be very clear," she began, looking not at Jackson, but at the veterans seated behind him, "that what I say here today is not about revenge. It's about recognition. Recognition of the pain that's been ignored, the warnings that were dismissed, and the wounds that never made it into any file or chart." She reached into her folder and held up a stack of letters, copies of the ones her office had received. "These are testimonies, not from lobbyists, not from pundits, but from those who wore the uniform and came back to a country that labeled their suffering as inconvenience." Then she locked eyes with Jackson. "Congressman Jackson," she said evenly, "your record may show years of service, but it also shows a trail of silence. You had men in your clinics, combat veterans, who told you they couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe, couldn't live. And instead of seeing them, you judged them. Instead of treating their trauma, you treated their skin as a filter for credibility." The room didn't move. "You didn't just doubt their pain," she continued. "You delegitimized it. You called their PTSD a trend. You told nurses to stop referring too many black males for psychiatric evaluation. You said, and I quote, 'They're just angry. That's not a disorder.'" There was no denial from the table, just stillness. Jasmine inhaled, calm, quiet, then shifted her tone. "I know Tamika's name is not in your records. I know the man in Houston who was turned away 3 times before his suicide isn't in your reports. But they are in mine, and they are here with us today." She gestured to the back of the room, where a mother held a folded photo of her son, Marine dress uniform, eyes too young to have seen what they did. A nurse next to her clutched a copy of a VA referral, never approved. Jasmine's voice lowered and somehow became even sharper. "This hearing isn't about whether you took an oath. We all did. This is about whether you honored it. Whether, in the quiet of the exam room, behind the desk, without cameras, you treated every veteran as equal, or whether you played gatekeeper to healing based on who they were." For 7 full minutes, she spoke. She cited data. She told stories. She read 3 names, then paused. She let the silence breathe. And then, in her final line, she delivered the sentence that would live on long after the hearing ended. "What we do here is not just policy, it's triage. And the longer we wait to admit the truth, the more blood we leave on the floor." She sat down. The room was still. Then, without instruction, they rose, one by one. First the veterans, then the nurses, then the aides, then the committee members. A slow, collective rising, not of protest, but of acknowledgement. A standing ovation in a congressional hearing. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Jackson didn't speak again, and for the first time in his career, he didn't need to be removed. He walked out on his own. head down, alone. And even after the standing ovation faded, even after the lights in the hearing room dimmed and the transcripts were filed away, the fight did not end. Ronnie Jackson still held his seat. He walked the same halls, voted on the same bills, appeared on the same talk shows. His name still bore the title representative. The scandal clung to him like a second shadow, but in the brutal arithmetic of politics, his base had not abandoned him. In some corners, he was now seen as a martyr, someone targeted by the radical left, punished for being honest. His allies closed ranks, his supporters flooded town halls, and the same machine that once shielded his silence now tried to smother the sound of the truth Jasmine had unleashed. But Jasmine, she didn't flinch. She didn't fold. She adapted. She endured. She fought smarter. Every time the opposition tried to delay her bill, she brought another veteran to the floor. Every time someone questioned the need for race-based health audits, she recited names of those who never made it past a waiting room. She didn't fight for applause anymore. She fought for permanence. And quietly, something extraordinary happened. The bill, the Crockett Health Equity Act, did not die in committee like so many others before it. It survived. It was debated. It was revised. It was kept alive. It wasn't just filed and forgotten. It moved. For the first time in U.S. history, a federal health care bill named after a black woman was scheduled for national floor debate. Cable news ran the headline across every channel. Crockett Act sparks nationwide conversation on health equity. It wasn't just a political event, it was a cultural rupture. Editorials ran in every major paper. Faith leaders invoked it in sermons. Universities hosted panels. Town halls exploded with testimony. Opponents tried to frame it as identity politics, but they were shouted down by nurses in worn sneakers, by veterans with old scars, by mothers holding photos instead of children. And for Jasmine, the cost had been steep. The death threats never stopped. The glass was repaired but never forgotten. She had lost nights, lost weight. Sometimes she lost sleep so deep it made her question the fight. But not once did she lose purpose. Because now when she returned to her district, she didn't walk alone. People followed her to meetings. Veterans shook her hand and whispered, "You said what we couldn't." Nurses brought her folded letters and hugged her like kin. Young girls in classrooms stood when she entered. And in one church on the east side of Fort Worth, someone had stitched her name, J. Crockett, into a quilt of civil rights leaders. She stood beneath that quilt one Sunday, looked at the faces, and quietly said to herself, "This isn't about me anymore." It never was. The night before the national vote on her bill, she walked into her office alone. The Capitol was quiet. The city was holding its breath. And in that silence, she sat at her desk and opened the first letter she had ever received about Tamika, from Tamika's own sister. The letter was wrinkled. The ink was faded, but the words cut like fresh glass. "I just want someone to say her name in a room where it matters." And Jasmine whispered, "I will." The next day, the Crockett Act was introduced for national vote. The chamber was full. The air was heavy. Some opponents gave speeches full of deflection about fiscal responsibility, about overreach, about how we can't legislate perception. But they were met with a wall of silent stares, because across the country, Americans were watching, and more importantly, remembering. When the votes were cast, the tally didn't break clean along party lines. A dozen Republicans crossed over. Some voted yes because they feared backlash, some because they saw the truth. One, an older veteran from Kentucky, stood up, looked Jasmine in the eye and said, "I didn't believe you at first, but then I checked my own records. You were right." The bill didn't pass that day, but it passed the floor, and it passed into history, because even as it moved to the Senate, where another battle awaited, the door had been opened, and it bore her name. Back in Fort Worth, Jasmine returned to the community center where she had once volunteered during law school. There was no stage, no cameras, just folding chairs and fluorescent lights. A child ran past her. A nurse handed her a clipboard. And as she walked through that room, the sound that followed her wasn't applause. It was trust, earned, carried, held with reverence. Because she hadn't just spoken truth to power, she had forced power to listen. And so, The story remains unfinished. Jackson still holds office. Jasmine still walks the long hallways. But now, whispers become witness. Silence becomes spotlight. And data becomes demand. Because somewhere between those two microphones, between the day glass shattered and the night her voice did not, something changed in the bloodstream of the country. And history will remember not just what she said, but what she revealed. Because when a doctor chose to look away, a lawyer forced him to see. But even after the camera stopped rolling, even after the votes were counted and the hearing rooms emptied into silent corridors, the story wasn't finished. Because what Jasmine Crockett had ignited was not a political spectacle. It was a reckoning. And reckoning doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It lingers in hospitals, in waiting rooms, in VA clinics, in policy briefs and handwritten letters, and in the quiet rooms where people have been suffering in silence for decades. This wasn't just about a corrupt congressman or a forgotten bill. This was about a system that had grown used to pretending that some pain mattered less. A system that dressed inequality in clinical language, buried bias under bureaucracy, and excused delay as protocol. A system that, for generations, had asked people of color to prove they were hurting, to quantify their suffering, to validate their trauma before being seen, not healed, just seen. And the most devastating part? It didn't start with cruelty. It started with indifference. That is what Jasmine came to destroy. She wasn't asking for a handout. She wasn't even demanding apologies. She was demanding recognition. She was demanding a country built on the promise of equality finally start keeping it. At the one place where it should be sacred, the exam table, the operating room, the emergency ward, the VA intake center, places where skin color should never determine how quickly help arrives, or if it arrives at all. So what's the lesson? It's that injustice doesn't always wear a robe or carry a gun. Sometimes it wears a white coat. Sometimes it holds a clipboard and says, "Wait here." Sometimes it signs a form that never gets filed, or makes a note that says drug-seeking behavior instead of chronic pain, or calls it anxiety when the real issue is postpartum hemorrhage, or says malingering when the man across from them is reliving Fallujah every time he shuts his eyes. This is the lesson, that systems don't fail people. They are designed by people. And what's designed can be redesigned, but only if someone has the courage to break it open first. Jasmine did that. She took the fury of every mother who had buried a child after being told, "It's probably just stress." She carried the weight of every veteran who walked out of a clinic with more silence than care. She became the voice for people who weren't famous, who weren't trending, who didn't have hashtags. People like Tamika, people whose names were buried in forms, abbreviated, filed and forgotten. And that is the deepest truth of this story. Change doesn't begin when laws are passed. It begins when silence ends. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that hearing to yell. She walked in with evidence. She walked in with names. She walked in with a truth so grounded in pain, so anchored in data, that even those who wanted to look away had to look up. And in doing so, she forced an institution that had always assumed it was above accountability to answer to the people it had failed. Her victory wasn't a headline. It wasn't the bill. It wasn't even the standing ovation. Her victory was in the faces of those who finally felt seen. The black nurse in Detroit who'd been written up for insubordination after questioning a treatment plan that nearly killed a patient. The father in Mississippi whose son died after 3 ER visits with no imaging ordered. The retired veteran in Arizona who mailed Jasmine a note with just 6 words. "You said what we couldn't say." That's what justice looks like. Not vengeance, not punishment, visibility, credibility, voice. The ability to stand in a room of power, stare it down and say, "This time, you don't get to ignore us." And for all the threats, all the broken glass, all the exhaustion, Jasmine never ran, because she understood something we all need to remember, that leadership isn't about volume. It's about truth. That advocacy isn't about anger. It's about refusing to let silence win. And that real courage is not measured by applause, but by whether you keep going when the room grows cold and your hands are still shaking. This story reminds us that policy is personal, that the numbers we quote mortality rates, wait times, misdiagnosis stats. Each contain a name, a body, a family, a future lost. And the only thing that stands between those numbers and justice is someone willing to say, enough. Someone like Jasmine. So what is the message? That justice doesn't trickle down. It is pushed forward by people who refuse to be moved. That the loudest stories aren't the ones screamed, but the ones told with the weight of lived truth. And that every time we allow injustice to be labeled anecdotal, we build another wall between power and accountability. But every time someone like Jasmine speaks up, we knock a brick loose. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day that wall will fall. And when it does, the first names we remember won't be the ones who built it. They'll be the ones who refused to let it stand. Because when a doctor chose to look away, a lawyer forced him to see. And if that wall is ever going to fall, we can't just watch. We have to act. Jasmine Crockett didn't step into that hearing alone so we could sit in silence. She risked everything, her safety, her future, her name, not to be admired, but to awaken us, to remind us that justice is not automatic and the truth will stay buried unless we dig it out together. So don't let her voice be the last. Don't let the Crockett Act become just another archive bill. Demand that your representatives read it, speak its name, challenge the silence in your own hospitals, clinics, and communities. Share your story, amplify the voices that have been dismissed for decades, because this fight isn't hers alone, it belongs to all of us now. Call your lawmakers, write the letters, organize the forums. Don't let them delay this with process and politics. Ask the hard questions. Who gets seen? Who gets heard? Who gets saved? And when they give you polite answers, push harder. Because somewhere right now, another Tamika is waiting in a hospital bed for someone to believe her pain is real. Somewhere, another veteran is being told to man up instead of being offered the care they earned. This is the moment to change that. Not tomorrow, not next session. Now. You have a choice. Be part of the silence or break it. The system counts on our fatigue. It thrives when we forget, but we won't. Not after Jasmine. Not after what she exposed. Not after the shattered glass and the 7-minute testimony that stopped a room cold. So don't just share the video. Share the responsibility. Make the next hearing louder. Make the next bill unstoppable. Make the next generation safer. Because the truth is out. The mirror has cracked, and what comes next is up to us. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.